Perception is a powerful force, shaping not only how we see the world, but also how we act within it. Every decision, every reaction, and every judgment we make often begins with perception. The stories our minds create before reality has the chance to speak for itself. In this story, when a police officer pulled over a black woman he found suspicious, his actions were not born from evidence or fact, but from the subtle, deeply rooted biases that have been programmed into society over generations. It wasn't about what she had done, but rather about what he thought she might do. And that difference, though invisible, carries devastating consequences. In moments like these, perception ceases to be a tool for awareness and becomes instead a weapon of assumption, capable of fracturing lives, trust, and dignity in mere seconds. The officer's decision to pull her over was likely framed by instinct, the kind that law enforcement officers are trained to trust. But instincts, when shaped by stereotypes, become unreliable guides. The human brain is wired to make split-second judgments, often drawing from cultural narratives and personal experiences rather than objective truth. For many officers, repeated exposure to crime reports, suspect descriptions, and fear-based media can unconsciously plant associations that equate certain races or appearances with danger. These associations linger, influencing decisions before reason can intervene. That is the hidden danger of perception. It doesn't ask for permission to act. It convinces the mind it's right, long before the facts are checked. When the woman opened her jacket, revealing the insignia of a colonel, that moment shattered the illusion built by perception. It was a confrontation between truth and bias, between who she was and who she had been assumed to be. The officer's silence in that instant spoke louder than any apology could. It was the sound of realization, the quiet collapse of prejudice under the weight of undeniable reality. The symbols on her uniform, the stripes, the stars, the name tag, weren't just markers of rank. They were proof of discipline, courage, and years of service. They represented a story of sacrifice and honor that stood in stark contrast to the assumption of suspicion. And in that confrontation, perception was stripped bare, revealing how fragile and flawed it truly is when left unchecked. This moment goes beyond one traffic stop. It reflects a larger issue that exists in countless interactions across the world: the silent, often invisible influence of racial bias on perception. Bias doesn't always manifest as hatred or open discrimination. Sometimes it's quieter, subtle, disguised as caution or protocol. A police officer may say they were simply following procedure, but deep down, the decision to act often carries the fingerprints of prejudice. The human mind likes shortcuts. It categorizes people into groups, simplifies complexity into assumptions. But in doing so, it sacrifices fairness for convenience. And when such shortcuts operate within systems of authority, the impact multiplies. The story forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. How often do we misread people because of the lenses through which we view them? Every day, individuals are judged not for their actions, but for their appearance, accent, or demeanor. In workplaces, schools, and public spaces, perceptions dictate opportunities and interactions. A confident black woman may be labeled as aggressive. A quiet man of color may be seen as untrustworthy. These perceptions don't exist in isolation. They form a feedback loop that reinforces inequality, feeding into stereotypes that continue to shape future perceptions. And unless actively challenged, this cycle persists, invisibly governing how we treat one another. The officer's silence wasn't just a response to surprise. It was a moment of reckoning. In that silence, perhaps he realized how narrow his understanding had been, how swiftly he had allowed bias to guide his judgment. That instant of realization, though painful, holds immense value. It is in those uncomfortable confrontations that growth begins. Awareness is born not from comfort but from dissonance, when what we believe clashes violently with what we see. For that officer and for many who witness such moments, the experience becomes a mirror, forcing them to see not the world as it is, but as they have been conditioned to see it. Perception, when influenced by bias, creates invisible hierarchies. It tells us who deserves respect, who warrants suspicion, who belongs, and who does not. It assigns danger to skin tones, authority to uniforms, and morality to appearances. And yet, as this story reveals, those hierarchies are illusions. The colonel's rank didn't make her more deserving of respect. It merely exposed the hypocrisy in how respect is distributed. The officer respected her only after he saw proof of her status. But what about before that? Should respect not be the starting point in every human interaction, regardless of identity or title? The tragedy of biased perception is that it denies dignity until it's earned, when in truth, dignity should be assumed until proven otherwise. In a just society, perception should be guided by awareness, not fear. Law enforcement officers, like all humans, carry personal biases, but the difference lies in training and accountability. Bias awareness programs, implicit bias testing, and real-world scenario training are essential to help individuals recognize and counteract these unconscious influences. The goal isn't to eliminate bias, and that's nearly impossible, but to prevent it from dictating behavior. When perception becomes self-aware, it can be recalibrated, refined, and made fairer. The problem is not that we perceive, but that we often refuse to question what we perceive. This story also reveals something deeper about power dynamics. The moment the woman revealed her colonel insignia, power shifted. The officer's authority, once unquestioned, was suddenly dwarfed by the weight of her status. It's a striking reminder that power and respect are often conditional in human interactions, extended freely to some, withheld from others, until credentials are shown. In that way, perception governs not only how we see others, but how we measure worth. The colonel's authority didn't just protect her in that moment. It exposed the fragility of systems built on visual and social hierarchies. It made visible the invisible, that respect in society often flows upward, not outward. When stripped of assumptions, perception becomes empathy. To perceive clearly is not to judge, but to understand. It requires seeing beyond what's visible, beyond the jacket, the color of skin, or the tone of voice, into the shared humanity that binds us. The tragedy of the incident is that such clarity only emerged after confrontation. The silence of the officer could have been a moment of humility, a rare pause where the noise of judgment fell away. And in that silence lies a lesson for all. Perception is not truth. It is merely perspective. Only through awareness and empathy can we begin to align what we see with what is real. There is a rare kind of authority that doesn't come from titles, uniforms, or visible power, but from a life built on discipline, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment. It's an authority that doesn't need to be spoken to be felt. In the moment when the officer pulled over the black woman, all he saw at first was someone who, in his mind, didn't belong. Someone suspicious simply because of how she looked or where she was. His training and his position gave him authority on paper, but her silence, her composure, and the quiet confidence in her posture carried a different kind of power. One that didn't demand recognition but commanded it naturally. When she unzipped her jacket and revealed the colonel insignia, the balance of power shifted not through confrontation, but through revelation. That moment wasn't just about military rank. It was about the deep human truth that respect earned through service and sacrifice holds more weight than authority given by circumstance. True authority is quiet. It doesn't need to announce itself or seek validation because it comes from an inner strength built over years of endurance and accountability. A colonel's insignia isn't just a badge of position. It represents years of leadership, countless moments of responsibility under pressure, and a lifetime of earned respect from those who served alongside. The woman's calmness in the face of accusation was not submission, but restraint, a control that comes from knowing her worth long before anyone else recognizes it. In that brief encounter, two worlds collided, one driven by external power, rooted in assumptions and fear, and another anchored in internal authority, grounded in experience and self-awareness. When the officer went silent, that silence was layered. On the surface, it was surprise, but underneath it was the dawning recognition that he had misjudged someone who had lived a life far beyond his understanding. His authority, once absolute, suddenly felt hollow against the gravity of hers. This moment reflected a truth about society, that we often confuse power with respect and command with leadership. The officer had positional power, the kind that enforces control. But she had moral authority, the kind that inspires it. The difference is profound. Power demands compliance. Authority earns acknowledgement. One is temporary and fragile. The other is enduring and self-sustained. This encounter serves as a metaphor for how respect functions in human relationships and institutions. It reveals that true respect can't be coerced or assumed. It must be earned through consistency, courage, and integrity. The colonel's insignia wasn't just a decoration. It symbolized those very qualities. It told the story of someone who had faced challenges far greater than a roadside encounter, someone who had proven herself not just to others, but to herself. The officer's silence was the unspoken recognition of that truth, the involuntary pause that comes when pretense collapses in the presence of authenticity. There is also a deeper, emotional undercurrent to moments like these, a tension between who society allows you to be and who you fought to become. For a black woman to rise to the rank of colonel is no small achievement. It represents a lifetime of breaking barriers, challenging expectations, and carrying the weight of representation. Every promotion, every mission, every act of leadership would have been shadowed by scrutiny that her counterparts might never have faced. Her insignia, therefore, wasn't just a mark of rank. It was a statement of resilience, a quiet defiance against every stereotype that had ever tried to limit her. When she revealed it, it wasn't simply to prove her innocence, but to confront the deeply ingrained assumption that authority has a face or a color. The officer's silence can be seen as the world pausing for reflection. It was as if the very system he represented had momentarily seen itself through her eyes, the unfairness, the double standards, the exhaustion of constantly having to prove one's worth. Yet she didn't meet bias with anger or arrogance. She let the truth speak for itself. That is the essence of true authority. It doesn't argue, it reveals. It doesn't impose itself. It stands firm and allows the truth of one's character to reshape the situation. The power of her presence in that moment was not in her words, but in her restraint. Her composure taught a lesson that no confrontation could, that dignity, when paired with strength, dismantles prejudice more effectively than rage ever could. In society, we often measure people's worth by external symbols, wealth, position, appearance, or profession, but this story challenges that notion. It shows how those symbols mean nothing without the integrity behind them. The colonel's insignia held power not because of the metal it was made of, but because of the life behind it. Every mission, every sleepless night, every act of leadership had infused that symbol with meaning. The officer's badge, too, was a symbol, but in that instant, one symbol overshadowed the other. Not because the military outranks the police, but because one authority had been earned through sacrifice while the other was being misused through bias. That silent exchange between them speaks volumes about the fragility of perception and the strength of earned respect. When the officer realized who stood before him, the hierarchy inverted, not in terms of societal structure, but in human depth. The woman's calm dismantled his assumption, and in doing so, it restored balance to an interaction that had begun unjustly. True authority does that. It restores balance where bias creates distortion. It teaches through presence rather than punishment, through truth rather than confrontation. What's remarkable about that moment is how little it took to shift the atmosphere. Not a speech, not a protest, just a gesture. The simple act of revealing her insignia became a profound statement about identity and recognition. It exposed how fragile superficial power is when faced with authenticity. The officer's silence wasn't just a reaction. It was submission to truth, an acknowledgement that authority born from service will always outrank authority born from assumption. And in that moment, she didn't need to demand respect. She embodied it. Authority, when real, doesn't need validation. It radiates through presence, through the way someone carries themselves even under pressure. That woman had faced far more dangerous situations than a traffic stop. Her calmness came from experience that the officer couldn't comprehend. Her authority came not from superiority, but from understanding, from the wisdom that comes only through years of responsibility. That's what makes true authority transformative. It humbles rather than humiliates, teaches rather than condemns. The story becomes a powerful reminder that respect and leadership aren't given by rank alone. They are upheld by character. The Colonel's insignia was simply the visible expression of something far greater. Her earned dignity, her resilience, her quiet strength. The officer's silence, uncomfortable as it was, became an acknowledgement of those qualities. It's a silence that many who carry prejudice encounter when faced with undeniable truth. The moment when bias loses its footing and humility takes its place. And while that silence may sting, it's also the sound of realization, the sound of growth beginning in the cracks of certainty. Humility is one of those rare qualities that often reveals itself only when pride collapses. The story of the officer pulling over the black woman who turned out to be a colonel is a profound example of how humility can be forced upon us by truth. In that single moment when she opened her jacket and exposed the insignia of her rank, everything the officer thought he knew unraveled. It was no longer about authority or suspicion, but about awareness, a sudden awakening to the flaws in his perception. The silence that followed wasn't simply embarrassment. It was a quiet reckoning, the kind that makes a person realize how easily prejudice can blind judgment. That moment carried a lesson in humility, not just for him, but for anyone who has ever let assumptions guide their actions before understanding the full picture. Awareness begins where arrogance ends. The officer believed he was in control, certain that his instincts were guiding him toward a justified stop. But his actions were clouded by unconscious bias, the kind that whispers judgments before reason can intervene. It's the bias that associates threat with color, suspicion with difference, and authority with a particular image. His badge gave him the illusion of moral certainty, the belief that his actions were always grounded in law and order. But humility has a way of exposing illusions. The moment he saw the insignia, he was forced to confront a truth that training manuals rarely prepare anyone for: that the world cannot be neatly divided into categories of threat and innocence based on appearances. Humility is what comes after that realization, when the need to dominate is replaced by the willingness to understand. The Colonel's calm composure in that moment contrasted sharply with his discomfort. She didn't shout or accuse. She didn't even need to defend herself with words. Her silence was dignified, her movements deliberate, as if she had experienced moments like this before and learned long ago that patience carries more weight than protest. Her restraint became the lesson. She held a mirror to his behavior without saying a word, forcing him to see his actions for what they were, not an exercise in justice, but an act of assumption. That is where awareness begins, in the space created by silence, where reflection replaces reaction. Humility isn't weakness. It's the courage to admit you were wrong and the strength to learn from it. Society often teaches people in positions of authority to assert dominance rather than introspection. Police officers, soldiers, leaders, even ordinary citizens are taught to stand firm in their beliefs. But conviction without reflection is dangerous. The officer's silence was the first step toward introspection, perhaps even the first genuine moment of awareness he had experienced in a long time. It stripped away the uniform, the badge, and the sense of superiority that came with them, leaving only a human being confronting another human being. The Colonel's rank symbolized not just authority, but experience, service, and sacrifice, qualities that the officer suddenly realized he had dismissed without consideration. Humility begins with recognition, and recognition often begins with discomfort. This story isn't just about race or authority. It's about the human tendency to judge before understanding. We all do it, in small and large ways, often without realizing it. The danger lies not in making judgments, but in refusing to question them. Awareness is not automatic. It has to be practiced. It requires pausing before reacting, listening before speaking, and seeking to understand rather than to categorize. The officer's moment of silence represents that pause, the brief space between ignorance and understanding where change becomes possible. If only for a moment he was aware of his assumptions, his limitations, and his bias. That awareness, though painful, is the seed from which growth begins. The colonel's insignia did more than clear her name. It shattered the invisible wall that prejudice had built between them. It exposed how easily people can dehumanize others when guided by fear or preconception. The irony is that the very system the officer represented, one built to uphold justice, had failed to teach him one of its most essential principles: humility in judgment. True justice requires awareness, and awareness requires humility. Without it, justice becomes selective, administered not through fairness, but through filtered perception. The colonel's dignity forced that awareness upon him, revealing that authority without humility is just arrogance wearing a uniform. In a broader sense, this encounter mirrors the struggle within society itself. Every time someone is misjudged because of their race, gender, or background, it's not just an individual failure, but a societal one. Systems built on hierarchy and assumption create conditions where humility becomes rare. People in power, whether officers, executives, or even educators, are often trained to command respect, not to offer it. Yet, as this story shows, true respect flows from mutual recognition, not superiority. The colonel didn't demand respect. She inspired it. Her poise reminded the officer that humility is not the opposite of strength, but its foundation. Awareness is also about recognizing the humanity in others, the understanding that behind every face, there is a story, a history, a set of experiences that deserve acknowledgement. The officer saw a suspicious woman. He didn't see the years she had spent serving her country, leading others, making decisions that impacted lives. That blindness is what prejudice does. It erases individuality and replaces it with stereotype. When she revealed her insignia, she forced him to see her story, to see her truth. That instant of revelation was a rebirth of perception. Awareness is not about gaining new knowledge, but about shedding false understanding. It's not learning something new, but unlearning something wrong. The most powerful moments of humility come not from being corrected by others, but from realizing within ourselves how wrong we've been. The officer's silence was not humiliation. It was humility taking root. There's a difference between being shamed and being awakened. Shame freezes, humility frees. Awareness doesn't seek to destroy the ego. It seeks to transform it. When humility enters the equation, empathy follows. The officer, perhaps for the first time, understood what it meant to see someone without bias. That single moment could have changed how he approached his work from then on, making him more aware, more patient, more human. Humility also teaches equality, that respect should never depend on appearances or rank, but should be the default in every human interaction. The colonel shouldn't have needed to prove her worth or her identity to deserve fair treatment. Yet her experience is a reflection of what many people face daily, the exhausting need to justify their presence or legitimacy. Awareness challenges this cycle by demanding self-reflection. It asks difficult questions. Why did I assume what I did? What stories am I believing without evidence? How often do I allow my own biases to shape my reality? Those questions don't have easy answers, but asking them is where humility begins to reshape behavior. The story lingers not because of confrontation, but because of transformation. A simple act of unzipping a jacket became a revelation. It turned suspicion into respect, arrogance into silence, and ignorance into awareness. The colonel didn't set out to teach a lesson, but she did. The officer didn't ask to learn one, but he did. That's the power of humility. It enters quietly, often through discomfort, and leaves behind understanding. It shows that awareness is not achieved through control, but through vulnerability, through the willingness to see ourselves as fallible. And when awareness and humility meet, they create the foundation for something greater, respect that is no longer conditional, but universal.